the main question, as we titled, why Russia is invading Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Good morning. And first of all, I would like to thank the Paris Advanced Research Center, and in particular, Dr. Nivedita for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to be a part of this discussion. So directly diving into the topic of why is Russia invading Ukraine, it has been very difficult to understand sort of the immediate cause, because if you only look at the Russian narrative, then the causes have ranged from denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, and it is difficult to sort of believe these as the causes that led to the invasion, right? So let's take a look at where we were immediately before the invasion, because it's now been over a month since Russia invaded Ukraine. And as you're all aware, just before that, Russia had already been building up the troops on the Ukraine border for several months. And this was the time when most experts believed that this would not lead to an actual war, that this was a usual bargaining tool that various countries employ at different times, the use of the threat of use of force to exchange certain concessions. So most of the experts believed that this was that Russia was wanting to talk to the United States about not just about Ukraine and its neutrality, but the broader issue of European security architecture. Russia has talked about this for a long time, and this was sort of Russia's opportunity to bring United States to the table and talk to it about it. And actually, before the war, some people actually thought that this was a good opportunity to make a deal between Russia and the West, settle this issue once and for all, and sort of establish a peace. So we also saw this in the Russian demands that it put forth, both for the United States and NATO. It talked about legally binding security guarantees, non-expansion of NATO, non-deployment of intermediate range and short-range missiles in Europe, limitations on military activities in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, Central Asia. So these were the demands that it put forth. I mean, obviously, all of these couldn't just be accepted by the West, but the United States and NATO both responded to those. The US even said that it could talk about some of these issues, and then the diplomatic process could sort of be taken forward. But the problem was the timeline didn't match, right? If the diplomatic process had to be carried forward, it would take some time. And at the same time, the military buildup is going on the borders, which cannot be sustained in the state of battle readiness for an indefinite period of time. So the troops either had to move forward or they had to move back. So the timelines of the diplomatic and the military buildup, it somehow didn't match. And at this point, you would see that there were already scholars who were saying that this situation is getting bad, that this is not just bargaining that Russia is doing, that the Minsk II was not being implemented, and Russia was deeply unhappy about the situation, and that this might lead to a bigger war. And Russia has often cited, all of us study the area, we know that Russia has often said that Ukraine is sort of a red line for us. Our security and economic interests are deeply involved in this country. And we don't have to agree with Russia on this, right? We don't have to agree with every Russian position, but we have to understand what Russia is saying in order to understand how the security dilemma developed in the region and how we have reached to the point where we have reached. So we saw in the past year that the Minsk agreement was not being implemented, and then Ukraine also became an enhanced opportunities partner of NATO last year. So it was becoming steadily more involved in engagement with the NATO, with the United States, with the EU. So there was a lot of defense cooperation that was ongoing, a lot of military sales that were happening. And Russia realized that its card was not working. So basically, in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, it supported the separatists in the Donbas Republic. What it was doing was this conflict was a means to an end. So basically, the conflict in the Donetsk and Luhansk led to the signing of the Minsk agreements. And this Minsk agreement was the Russian instrument to control or sort of influence the policies in Ukraine so that Ukraine did not go over to the West. So this was to be done through, so the Minsk agreement says that the Donetsk and Luhansk will have a special status. And this was very controversial. This has been very controversial in Ukraine because Ukraine doesn't want to give these states that kind of autonomy that would give Donetsk and Luhansk a say in the future policies of Ukraine. But that was what was envisioned in the Minsk agreements. So this has not been implemented because there's a lot of domestic opposition in Ukraine to this sort of autonomy being given to the separatist republics. Then there was also there's another issue on Minsk that has led to a lot of disagreements, is the interpretation of the Russian role in the crisis, because Russia is also a party to the Minsk agreements, but it is also, you're right in the sense that we have come to this crisis at this point in our time, not just because the it was the actions of one state. So it's not just Russia. It's also, it's what Russia did, it's what the EU did, it's what the West did, and it's also what these post-Soviet states did. So in a sense, what they were trying to do was every state was trying to expand its influence, right? Or they were trying to expand their own security. But the unintended consequences of those have brought us to this point. So you're absolutely right in the sense that the expansion of NATO or the expansion of the EU, which Russia clearly said that we are concerned about this. The problem was those concerns were not addressed. But if you look at this particular invasion and the way it has been planned, like it's like, I think it's important to understand that this particular decision to invade has been Russia's, right? So so whatever the causes that led up to that point, yes, in that the West is also complicit, because there's this important debate about what if the Minsk agreements had been implemented? Could that have been the way to stop the war? Could the neutrality of Ukraine have been negotiated before the war? Because now Ukraine is itself saying, okay, we're not getting into it. So could this have been done before? So all of these questions, yes, in all of these, absolutely West is complicit. But I also don't want to undermine the fact that this invasion was actually Russia's decision. So, it's not just fault of one country. It's been a combination of factors which is built literally from 1991 to today that has brought us to this point. So yeah, you're right in that part. Yeah.
Dr. Nivedita, we have also some comment and I think one question from Wilfried Stefan Zongrana. She says, thanks for the excellent presentation. I do agree that the security dilemma is always very complex because one action of one country is always misunderstood by the other. Why did the West push with invading Ukraine to join, knowing fully well that Russia will never agree?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because that's the point, that the West is not actually inviting Ukraine to join NATO. It's a promise that has been given for the future. And given the kind of opposition there is within the European Union for a membership of NATO, for giving the Ukraine a membership of NATO, it was pretty clear to everyone that Ukraine was never going to join, right? And I think there are quite a few scholars who have written about this in the recent past, who are saying that this promise was an empty promise. So, and that's the thing which is very difficult to understand. That why was this announced at the 2008 NATO summit when there were serious differences within the NATO organization, and any extension of a membership of NATO has to be consensual. The United States can't do this on its own. Everybody has to agree, and if countries like France and Germany are disagreeing, then it was pretty clear that this was that Ukraine would never get into NATO, and this was, I think, one mistake that absolutely should have been avoided, because when you formally put this in a NATO document, that these countries will get a membership at a future date, and then Ukraine also includes this in its constitution, right? Ukraine has now written in its constitution that we aspire towards NATO membership. So then, when you see those two things together, it's obvious that Russia sees these things as a threat. So I think on that score, the West should have been very, very careful, and that was one huge misstep.